This video discusses what regimes are and what principles we use to evaluate them. To summarize, regimes are the overall political system in a country, and we assess their quality in different ways depending on regime type. We evaluate democracies and democratic institutions on how accountable, responsive, transparent, and representative they are. We evaluate dictatorships on how they manage elites, publics, and the military through a balance of repression and patronage. We evaluate both types based on how long they last and categorize them by how they choose and transfer power between leaders. I'm going to start off by saying that this is actually my own personal take on these ideas. I've never quite seen the material presented this way, but honestly I find it the most useful way to do so. This is also a very conceptual video. It's all about how you can evaluate arguments and how you can think about concepts. First, what exactly is a regime? I use this term to mean the overall system of government, essentially democracy or dictatorship. Scholars will often use more technical definitions. For example, Barbara Geddes sees regimes as groups of linked leaders in a country. But I find it best to follow Philippe Schmitter and Terry Lynn Carl and their view that a regime is a system of governance that determines access to public office. And one way to think about the distinction between regimes is where their legitimacy derives from. Is it from the public, or is it from something else? The most basic way to evaluate and compare regimes is based on how long they last. This is called durability. Is a country able to keep the same way of choosing a leader for a long time, or does it change every few years? The United States is an example of a durable regime. We've had the same basic system and constitution for over 200 years. Durability, though, doesn't mean nothing changes. As Huntington argued in Political Order in Changing Societies, institutions need to adapt to new circumstances if they want to persist. What durability means is that there is continuity, even as they reform. The other commonality in how we look at both democracy and dictatorship is how we classify their subcategories. We use the procedures to select and transfer power between leaders to describe them. Democracies are presidential or parliamentary. Dictatorships might select leaders by birth, as in monarchies, or through political parties, as in party-based dictatorships. Aside from that, we tend to assess democratic and authoritarian institutions with distinct criteria. First, democracies. We compare democratic institutions to each other based on how accountable, responsive, transparent, and representative they are. Accountability means how well citizens are able to hold a person or party responsible for the policies they enact. This is partly about the procedures for elections, or hiring procedures within a bureaucracy. Essentially, is it actually possible to remove someone from office if you disapprove of something that they did? Retroactive theories of voting focus on this. The idea is that voters choose who to vote for based on their records, based on what those politicians did in the past. This requires both procedures that allow you to do that and clarity of responsibility. You know which politicians are responsible for what records. Responsiveness means how well politicians and bureaucratic agencies implement the public's policy preferences in between elections. Are there channels in place to obtain public input on regulations and legislation? Do politicians listen to the public when they vote on laws, or do they just do what they think is right and then let the voters approve or disapprove on election day? Transparency is about how the public can get information about their government. There are three elements to this. First, are rules and regulations written down? While this is obvious in places like the United States, developing democracies do not always have a bureaucratic tradition, and informal networks may determine access to public services or the policy process more than written rules. Second, do the media and civil society have access to public documents and policymakers? Average citizens don't usually look up information on laws and regulations, but instead they rely on the news and interest groups to find and distribute this information. Regular publication of laws and regulations, plus FOIA, that's Freedom of Information laws, and protections for whistleblowers, are all considered necessary for transparency. This is because they ensure that interested parties can learn what the government is actually doing. Finally, transparency today often means e-government. This is the availability of government documents and government services online. Essentially, what do governments make available to citizens online, and how easy is it to access that? Finally, representativeness means how well a government reflects, in terms of seats in parliament or the cabinet, the political preferences of its population. For example, if 20% of the population votes for a particular political party, A fully representative government would have 20% of seats in parliament go to that political party. Different democracies place different emphasis on these values and implement them in different ways. And sometimes there are trade-offs between them. The clearest trade-off is between accountability and representativeness in a country's electoral law. That's its rules for holding elections. Countries that assign seats in parliament based on the overall proportion of votes a party gets in a national election, like Germany, for example, tend to have very representative governments. The makeup of parliament reflects citizens' votes more accurately. Countries that elect single representatives from geographic districts, like the United States, usually end up with less representative governments. The clearest example of this is the US presidential election system. The person who wins the most votes at the national level does not necessarily win the election. Majoritarian systems, again, this is the United States, are, however, better at accountability than proportional systems. That's Germany. When voters choose a party or a list of candidates, they don't really have a single person they can go to ask for help from the government. And constituent services are something that every parliamentarian is supposed to do. In addition, when countries are governed by coalitions, it's harder to know what policies individual parties in that coalition are responsible for, and so it's hard to base your vote based on their record. Turning to dictatorships, they do not rule based on popular legitimacy, and so we need different criteria to judge them. Overall, what you want to look at is the combination of carrots and sticks, that's patronage and repression, that dictatorships use in managing their elites and their publics. Elites are people with economic or social power. They're potential rivals to a dictator, and he needs their support in order to maintain control. They are most often managed through patronage and co-optation. This is giving them benefits to support the political system. But repression is also used against them. Dissident leaders and defectors from the regime are often arrested and killed. And while dictatorships do not base their rule on support from the public, no government can survive with absolutely no popular support. Dictators can build public support through clientelism. This is, again, giving benefits to supporters, as well as incorporation. This is creating political parties and other institutions to generate propaganda in support of the leader, and channels through which the public can publicly demonstrate their support for the regime. Repression is, of course, also present, usually in the form of violent crackdowns on protests. Finally, since all dictators rely on repression to some extent to maintain their power, they need to manage their relationship with the security services, making sure the military and police are well supplied, but not so powerful that they could overthrow the leader himself. Again, so these have been overall concepts you can use to think about democracy and dictatorship and how they govern. We will talk more about them in our last unit, but for now I wanted to make sure you had these principles for evaluation.